I bid you welcome.
I welcome you to my house.
Welcome to my house.
Welcome to my home.
Hello Horror Hounds, welcome to my horror house and welcome back to our journey through the portmanteau and anthology horror movies of Amicus Productions. We reach Asylum, which is a particular highlight of the run for me. It's directed by Roy Ward Baker and written once again by Robert Bloch, adapting his own short stories. It starts as a car arrives at the titular asylum to the bombastic music A Night at Bald Mountain. There is nothing subtle about the start of this movie whatsoever, and nor should they be. These portmanteau movies from Amicus go for short, sharp rabbit punches to the nose rather than subtle creeps. The arrival is Robert Powell playing a psychiatric doctor who has turned up at the establishment to take his post there as a psychiatric doctor, only to find that the doctor who hired him has now gone insane and is one of the inmates at the asylum. And the new doctor who runs the asylum wants to set him a little test, and if he passes, he can get the job. He will be taken upstairs and he will meet 4 inmates, 4 different case studies, because Dr. Starr, who hired him, has now taken on a whole new personality. If he can diagnose which of these 4 patients is Dr. Starr, then he's qualified to take the job. It's a wonderful little wraparound which organically sort of enfolds in the 4 little short stories we're going to see. Because they're adaptations of Bloch's own stories, they all deal with, as you might expect from the writer of Psycho, notions of madness and identity. So there's a wonderful sort of thematic through line. There's a unity to the whole endeavour, which you don't often get with these, where Milton Subotsky will sometimes go, oh, I don't know, 5 guys are stuck in a lift, which we will get to. This is just a cut above, a little like The House That Dripped Blood, which was the last movie that Bloch wrote. He seems to take a little bit more care and attention. The first story then is called Frozen Fear, and our patient is Bonnie. She is the mistress of a guy who we see interacting with his wife. His wife holds the purse strings. All the money is hers, and she has this guy under her thumb completely, apart from the fact that what she doesn't realise is that her husband and his mistress plan to bump her off. Oh, and another little character tidbit they give about her right at the start. She's studying under some kind of swami who practices a sort of voodoo, but that's not going to come back and bite anyone in the ass, is it? This poor woman goes to pieces literally at the wrong end of a hatchet and ends up in a chest freezer with her voodoo amulet. And as you might imagine, she doesn't stay in the freezer for too long. The sort of slapstick visual gag horror that comes at the end of this segment is reminiscent of the slapstick type humour and body horror we get from the Reanimator movies later on, although here, as you will understand, it's much more toned down. It's utterly ludicrous, and like many of the stories in these Amicus portmanteau movies, it comes from a much simpler time when you seemingly could get away with much more outrageous leaps of logic and suspensions of disbelief. We're talking about an era where just the simplest mention of the possible potential inclusion of voodoo can hand wave away any questions you might have about the logic of the plot. But how did she go? Voodoo. I don't quite understand how the voodoo. Why would the head be able to voodoo? The second story is called The Weird Tailor, and weird is the perfect word for it. And the patient is called Bruno, who is an old Jewish tailor. He's got more than a hint of the Geppetto about him, which gives this story very much a dark fairy tale feel. Think dark Disney with maybe a hint of some Lovecraft in there, and you've got the tone set, I think. Anyway, in 1 week's time, he and his daughter are going to be kicked out of their home and establishment because they can't make the rent. In walks a very eerie Peter Cushing with a business proposition that sounds too good to be true. He wants a suit made. Well, you're in the right place. You're in a tailor's after all, but he wants a suit made from a very specific material which he has brought, and to very specific specifications to do with dates and times and rituals when the suit should be put together. I love this segment, and it's a great example of the uncanny, the type of material that they use which reflects the light in a really weird way. That word weird again, which is so appropriate, just gives everything a sort of other, unworldly, unknowable feel. And then to have this strange occult material rendered down into an object, in this case a suit, to be used for what purpose, we find out, and that reveal itself is really quite special, and I won't give that away. Cushing here is in sinister and aloof mode, even so managing to inject his character with streaks of empathy when needed. The man's just a master. All told, I think this story could have been given maybe a little bit more time to breathe, because the ending is just comes out of nowhere, and itself is really a weird perversion of the intention of this ritual and this material. I'm a big fan of this segment. It works pretty much on every level for me. The third patient is called Barbara, in a segment called Lucy Comes to Stay. Barbara is played by Charlotte Rampling, and this is a typical Blochian tale of identity and madness. And as soon as you realise that this story comes from the pen of the author of Psycho, you will see what's coming a country mile away, although Lucy Comes to Stay was written before Psycho. Barbara is being brought home from some sort of institution by her brother, who has hired a sort of more or less live-in nurse to look after her and essentially keep her sedated, because she has a habit of getting in trouble any time she socialises with her friend Lucy. She promises not to mention Lucy again and not to see Lucy, and lo and behold, Lucy does turn up. Lucy's played by Britt Ekland, and you only ever see Lucy and Barbara together. Why doesn't Lucy interact with any of the other characters in this segment? You will be way, way, way ahead of this, and it's sort of there, doesn't outstay its welcome and goes, but there's nothing new here to shock or surprise you. Unlike the fourth story, Mannequins of Horror, the patient being Dr. Byron, played by the wonderful Herbert Lom. This section will surprise you, I think. Maybe not in the way it's intended to. Dr. Byron makes tiny little dolls, simulacra of people at the asylum, and he insists to the nascent new doctor that the inside of these models are perfect in every detail. They even have tiny little working brains, and he's made a model of himself, and the next step is for him to transfer his consciousness into this tiny little model and exist therein for purposes I don't know. And this little section, I think the intent outreaches the ability. The little models that are used are not, I imagine, what Robert Bloch had in his mind when he conjured them up with this story. They're little wind-up robots with plasticine likenesses of heads on top of them. Personally, I can't help but laugh at the incongruity of the doom-laden music playing over a little wind-up robot with a plasticine Herbert Lom head walking down a corridor. I suspect in prose form, the story that it's being adapted from is probably a really creepy little read. It's just that some things imagined from the page can spring to life, but when realised on screen look a little bit silly. The resolution you might, 21st century cynical viewer who's seen it all, you might see that coming as well. You probably will. It doesn't matter. I think it's actually played out really well. It's satisfying, and then the whole thing ends again with the notion of not necessarily a time loop, but a cyclical story. It's beginning all over again, this cyclical wraparound thing, which we know that Milton Subotsky loves because he loved it in Dead of Night, which was his North Star for all of these portmanteau movies. And if you're going to choose a North Star like that, you might as well choose one that is bloody fantastic as Dead of Night. So that was Asylum, a really strong entry. And next we're going to be looking at Vault of Horror, a second delve into the archives of the EC Horror Comics Vault of Horror and Tales from the Crypt, which just so happens to be the Some Guys Are Trapped in a Lift one. I hope you can join me then.